Sir Maurice Oldfield was the absolute commander of MI6, but behind the fortified walls of Century House lay the most shocking British spygate secret of the Cold War. Nightly, he risked the Western Intelligence Alliance for anonymous encounters with Soho rent boys. When MI5 finally caught him, Margaret Thatcher didn't prosecute. She executed a massive state cover-up. The absolute power wielded by Sir Maurice Oldfield is difficult to overstate. Born in 1915 to a farming family in Derbyshire, he did not fit the traditional aristocratic mold of the British intelligence officer. He was not a product of Eton. He was an academic, a brilliant historian who clawed his way into the elite circles of the establishment through sheer intellect and a preternatural talent for counter-espionage during the Second World War. By the time he reached the top of MI6 in the 1970s, he had cultivated a persona of total monastic dedication to the state. He was a lifelong bachelor, slightly overweight, peering through thick spectacles. He looked like a provincial bank manager. This unassuming exterior was his greatest weapon. It masked a razor-sharp analytical mind that outmaneuvered Soviet intelligence officers across Europe and the Middle East. He demanded absolute perfection and zero operational deviance from his field agents. The 1970s intelligence landscape was a highly toxic environment. The British establishment was suffering from severe institutional trauma. The intelligence services had recently been gutted by the revelation of the Cambridge Five, a ring of upper-class, highly educated British spies including Kim Philby and Guy Burgess, who had been secretly working for the Soviet KGB for decades. The damage they inflicted was incalculable. They compromised thousands of operations and sent hundreds of Allied agents to execution. Several members of the Cambridge Five were openly homosexual or bisexual. In the prevailing culture of Whitehall and the military establishment, this fact solidified a devastating institutional prejudice. Homosexuality was not simply treated as a moral failing or a criminal offense under British law. It was officially classified as a terminal security risk. The logic of the era was brutal and mechanical. The KGB dedicated massive resources to identifying the sexual secrets of Western diplomats and military officers. They built entire operational wings focused on the honey trap, luring targets into hotel rooms rigged with hidden cameras and audio recording equipment, using male and female prostitutes. Once a target was photographed in a compromising position, the KGB applied the leverage. The target was given a simple choice: hand over classified state secrets, or have the photographs mailed to their superiors, their families, and the press. Because homosexuality carried such heavy legal and social penalties in Britain, gay men in government were considered the ultimate, most easily exploitable targets for Soviet blackmail. The system responded with the positive vetting process. Every intelligence officer was subjected to intense invasive psychological and background checks designed to root out hidden debt, addiction, and homosexuality. Anyone suspected of deviance was immediately purged, stripped of their clearance, and blacklisted. Oldfield enforced these rules. He signed the termination papers for junior officers who failed the vetting process. He operated at the very apex of a machine designed to destroy anyone carrying the exact secret he harbored. The physical and psychological contrast of his existence was staggering. By day, he operated inside Century House, a towering, brutalist concrete fortress south of the River Thames that served as MI6 headquarters. The building was swept daily for electronic listening devices. Access was tightly restricted by armed guards and steel blast doors. Inside those walls, Oldfield briefed the Prime Minister, coordinated with the CIA in Washington, and managed a shadow war against the Soviet Union. He was untouchable. He was the state incarnate. By night, he descended into a completely different geography. Soho in the 1970s was a labyrinth of vice. It was an unregulated zone of strip clubs, illegal gambling dens, and shadowy doorways controlled by organized crime. It was the epicenter of London's rough trade, a specific subculture of male prostitution where young men, often drifters, criminals, or runaways, sold sex to older, affluent men. The transaction was fast, anonymous, and inherently dangerous. The men working the streets of the West End did not ask for names, and their clients did not offer them. Oldfield did not seek out discreet high society encounters behind closed doors. He craved the immediate, raw risk of the street. He left his fortified office, slipped away from his official routines, and wandered the dark alleys around Piccadilly Circus. He approached strangers. He negotiated cash transactions in the shadows. He took unidentified men into rented rooms or the back seats of cars. The mechanical risk of this behavior defies rational explanation. He was the man who wrote the security protocols on how to evade KGB surveillance. Yet he routinely placed himself in situations where he was entirely defenseless. He handed his physical safety and his reputation over to petty criminals and desperate young men on a nightly basis. Any single one of those encounters could have ended in a violent mugging. Any single rent boy could have recognized the face of the man frequently pictured in the broadsheet newspapers attending state dinners. More terrifyingly, Soviet intelligence watchers heavily monitored London. KGB operatives routinely stalked the streets, looking for vulnerabilities in British officials. If a single Soviet watcher had identified the Director General of MI6 picking up a prostitute, the operation would have launched immediately. The KGB would not have assassinated him. They would have photographed him. They would have placed the evidence in a manila envelope and delivered it to him with a list of demands. The head of British intelligence would have become an active Soviet asset. He would have been forced to feed his own agents directly to the KGB executioners in Moscow to keep his secret safe. Oldfield operated in this state of supreme cognitive dissonance for years. He isolated his daytime authority from his nighttime compulsion. The sheer arrogance required to maintain this dual existence suggests a man who believed his intellect and his value to the state made him immune to consequence. He believed he could outsmart his own nature and the entire counter-espionage apparatus of the free world. He retired as chief of MI6 in 1978. His reputation flawless, his knighthood secured, his secret seemingly buried. He had survived the High Wire Act. The story should have ended there. The vulnerability should have closed. But power is an addiction as potent as any physical vice. In 1979, the political landscape shifted violently. The Provisional IRA escalated their bombing campaign, turning Northern Ireland into a war zone and striking directly at the heart of the British mainland. The new Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, demanded a ruthless restructuring of the domestic security response. She needed a coordinator, a single terrifying authority figure to unify the military, the police, and intelligence services against the terrorist threat. She looked at the retired roster and chose the man considered the most capable and uncompromising intelligence mind in the country. She called Sir Maurice Oldfield back into active service. He accepted the appointment as security coordinator in Northern Ireland. It was a fatal miscalculation. Leaving the quiet safety of retirement meant stepping back into the intense glare of the security apparatus. He was no longer an anonymous retiree. He was a high-value target in an active conflict zone. The state assigned him a permanent elite police protection detail. Armed officers monitored his residence, drove his armored cars, and logged his daily movements. The privacy he required to feed his compulsion vanished instantly. The machine he helped build was now watching him. The assignment to Belfast in October 1979 was an act of desperation by the British government. The late summer of that year had brought unprecedented devastation to the establishment. In a single day in August, the Provisional IRA assassinated Lord Mountbatten by detonating a bomb on his fishing boat off the coast of Ireland, and hours later executed a coordinated ambush at Warren Point that killed 18 British soldiers. The state was bleeding. The intelligence apparatus in Northern Ireland was fractured, with the Royal Ulster Constabulary MI5 and military intelligence operating in hostile silos, refusing to share information and running conflicting covert operations. Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher demanded a brutal restructuring. She needed an apex predator to force the warring intelligence factions into a unified weapon against the IRA. Oldfield was the obvious choice. He arrived in Belfast possessing supreme executive authority. The environment he entered was a highly kinetic war zone. As the newly appointed security coordinator, Oldfield was instantly the highest value assassination target for paramilitary groups on the island. The state responded by enveloping him in an impenetrable security bubble. He was housed in a heavily fortified annex of Stormont Castle. His movements were dictated by threat assessments. He traveled exclusively in convoy, riding in the back of armor-plated rovers flanked by armed escort vehicles. His close protection detail consisted of elite officers from the RUC Special Branch, men trained to anticipate sniper fire, car bombs, and close-quarters assassination. They shadowed his every physical movement. They stood outside his office door, they sat at the adjacent table in dining rooms, and they maintained a constant vigil outside his sleeping quarters. For Oldfield, this level of scrutiny was an entirely new, suffocating reality. As the chief of MI6, he had operated from the insulated heights of Century House in London. He controlled the surveillance apparatus. He was rarely its subject. In London, his status had allowed him to slip the leash. He could dismiss his driver, cancel his schedule, and vanish into the anonymity of the city to feed his compulsion in the dark corners of Soho. Belfast offered no such operational flexibility. The city was physically divided by military checkpoints and sectarian borders. There was no anonymity. For a man addicted to the high-risk transactional encounters of the urban underworld, the lockdown at Stormont Castle acted as a vice. Addiction does not respect geography, nor does it yield to national security protocols. The psychological architecture of Oldfield's compulsion was deeply entrenched. Decades of leading a double life had wired his brain to require the release of illicit, anonymous encounters. Deprived of his usual hunting grounds in London, the pressure within him escalated. He could not maintain the sterile, monitored existence of a targeted warlord indefinitely. The cracks in his operational security began to show during his scheduled weekend trips back to the British mainland. Oldfield maintained a private flat in Marsham Court, Westminster. These brief returns to London were ostensibly for high-level briefings at Whitehall and brief respites from the pressure cooker of Belfast. But for Oldfield, they were opportunities to breathe, to slip back into the nocturnal rhythms he craved. He attempted to apply his tradecraft against his own bodyguards. He would try to dismiss his protection detail for the evening, insisting he was simply retiring to his flat to read and required absolute privacy. He would wait for the perimeter to relax and then he would leave. But close protection officers are trained to notice anomalies. A bodyguard's primary directive is the constant physical accounting of their principal. A missing principal is a dead principal. The men assigned to Oldfield were not junior beat cops. They were hardened special branch operatives. They quickly recognized that the former head of foreign intelligence was deliberately breaking his own security perimeter. They noted the unexplained absences in the early hours of the morning. They observed him returning to the Westminster flat disheveled long after he had supposedly gone to sleep. More damning than his absences was the company he kept. The protection officers began to notice the specific demographic of young men loitering near his residence or frequenting the pubs Oldfield suddenly favored. These were not government officials, civil servants, or military attachés. They were young, rough, and entirely out of place in Oldfield's orbit. The visual contrast was jarring. The architect of British counterterrorism standing in the shadows with transient youths. The police logs recorded these events with clinical detachment, time of departure, time of return, condition of the subject, unidentified male contacts observed in proximity. Over the course of several months, a concrete, undeniable pattern emerged. The data did not point to a man conducting off-the-books intelligence meets. It pointed to a man actively soliciting prostitutes. The chain of command in executive protection is absolute. A bodyguard cannot ignore a principal's erratic behavior, especially when that behavior exposes the principal to extortion. The officers guarding Oldfield quietly escalated their observations. The reports moved from the immediate protection detail up the hierarchy of the special branch, bypassing standard bureaucratic channels. The Whisper Network activated. The information was too explosive to be mishandled. The commander of the RUC Special Branch recognized that this was no longer a simple protection issue. It was a catastrophic counterintelligence vulnerability. The file was securely transferred across the Irish Sea, landing directly on the desk of Sir Howard Smith, the Director General of MI5. The historic rivalry between MI5 and MI6 is woven into the fabric of the British state. MI6 operates abroad, gathering foreign intelligence and running covert operations. They view themselves as the elite tip of the spear. MI5 operates domestically, hunting spies, terrorists, and internal subversives. They are the meticulous, often resentful watchdogs of the homeland. The two agencies fiercely guard their jurisdictions and rarely share their secrets willingly. Now, the head of domestic intelligence possessed raw, actionable intelligence that the legendary former chief of MI6 was a chronic active security risk. Sir Howard Smith did not immediately launch an open investigation. The bureaucratic terror of the situation required extreme caution. An accusation of this magnitude against a figure of Oldfield's stature could destroy the agency, making it if the evidence did not hold up. Furthermore, Oldfield was not a relic. He was an active, vital component of Margaret Thatcher's war council. Moving against him meant disrupting the entire Northern Ireland security strategy. Smith ordered a silent parallel investigation. MI5 watchers were deployed in London to verify the special branch reports. They mapped Oldfield's movements during his weekend respites. They shadowed him as he left Marsham Court. They observed him entering the specific marginalized sectors of the West End. They documented the transactions. The Domestic Intelligence Agency turned its forensic gaze upon the man who had spent his life running agents across the globe, treating him exactly as they would a suspected Soviet asset. The intelligence gathered by M. Wallner 5 was devastatingly thorough. It stripped away the myth of the infallible spy master and revealed the pathetic, dangerous reality of his compulsion. The evidence proved that Oldfield had successfully hidden his homosexuality from the positive vetting process for his entire career. It proved that he routinely engaged the services of rent boys, individuals highly susceptible to police pressure or foreign bribery. It proved that the man entrusted with the nuclear codes and the identities of every deep-cover British operative had spent decades handing the KGB the exact leverage they required to turn him. The vulnerability was not theoretical. It was active, ongoing, and fully documented by his own government. The trap had been painstakingly constructed out of Oldfield's own actions. The file was complete. There was no more room for observation. The domestic agency had to sever the rot before a hostile intelligence service exploited it. The weaponization of intelligence against one of its own architects requires absolute precision. Sir Howard Smith, the Director General of MI5, understood that he was handling an active grenade. He could not act unilaterally. He could not dispatch officers to arrest Sir Maurice Oldfield in Belfast. Such an action would trigger a public spectacle, alerting the IRA, the KGB, and the global press that the British security apparatus was in a state of civil war. The execution had to be bureaucratic, silent, and fatal. Bypassing law enforcement entirely, Smith carried the completed surveillance dossier straight to the absolute center of the British civil service, the office of the Cabinet Secretary, Sir Robert Armstrong. In the hierarchy of the United Kingdom, the Cabinet Secretary is the ultimate mandarin, the permanent official who ensures the continuity of the state, regardless of which political party holds power. Armstrong was the gatekeeper to Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the designated custodian of the government's darkest secrets. When Armstrong opened the MI5 file, he was not reading about a policy failure. He was looking at the blueprint for the total collapse of Western intelligence credibility. The documents laid out a forensic timeline of Oldfield's nocturnal excursions in London, corroborated by the alarmed reports from the RUC Special Branch Protection Detail in Belfast. The implications were immediate and terrifying. If Oldfield had been compromised by Soviet agents during any of these anonymous encounters, every piece of intelligence shared between Washington and London over the past decade was potentially in Moscow's hands. The special relationship with the CIA, built on absolute trust and secure communication, would be severed overnight if the Americans learned that the British had placed a chronic security risk at the absolute pinnacle of their intelligence network. Armstrong recognized that standard disciplinary procedures were irrelevant. This was an existential crisis of state security. Oldfield had to be removed from his post in Northern Ireland instantly, and his security clearance had to be permanently revoked. But the extraction had to be executed without alerting the subject to the trap. Oldfield was a master of tradecraft. If he suspected he was under investigation, he might attempt to leverage his own vast knowledge of state secrets to ensure a mutually assured destruction. Or worse, he might panic and become unpredictable. The summons was crafted with a deceptive routine. In March 1980, a secure message was transmitted to Stormont Castle. Oldfield was requested to return to London for a high-level briefing regarding the ongoing security situation in Northern Ireland. It was a perfectly standard request for a man in his position. He traveled back to the mainland under the usual heavy guard, crossing the Irish Sea completely unaware that his own protection detail had served as the primary witnesses for his prosecution. The establishment eschewed standard interrogation cells and secure MI5 bunkers for this confrontation. They opted instead for a quietly elegant wood-paneled room in Whitehall, turning the architecture of power itself into a psychological weapon. This was not a criminal proceeding. It was an eviction from the ruling class. When Oldfield walked into the room, he expected a strategic discussion on IRA paramilitaries. Instead, he found Sir Robert Armstrong and Sir Howard Smith waiting for him. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. There were no briefing papers on the table, only a single thick dossier. The psychological collapse of a spy master is a quiet, brutal process. Oldfield had spent his entire adult life reading the tales of nervous informants, interrogating defectors, and anticipating hostile maneuvers. The moment he saw the faces of the cabinet secretary and the head of MI5, he recognized the operational reality. The trap had sprung. The doors were closed. There was no perimeter to breach, no cover story to deploy. Armstrong did not yell. The British establishment executes its own with chilling politeness. He spoke in the measured, clinical tones of a senior civil servant delivering an undeniable truth. He informed Oldfield that extreme irregularities had been brought to the government's attention regarding his personal conduct. He did not ask questions, he presented facts. Smith opened the dossier. They laid out the timeline. They detailed the specific dates and times he had slipped his protection detail in London. They recounted the precise locations in Soho and the West End. They described the young, unidentified men he had solicited. They weaponized Oldfield's own nocturnal routine against him, demonstrating that the domestic intelligence apparatus had tracked his movements with the same ruthless efficiency he had once demanded of his own officers in hostile territories. The fundamental rule of hostile interrogation is to deny the interrogator a baseline. An operative is trained to lie, to deflect, to maintain the constructed narrative until the very end. But Oldfield was not facing a foreign adversary. He was facing the absolute verified intelligence of his own government. He possessed the intellect to instantly calculate his odds. He knew the capabilities of MI5 watchers. He knew that if Armstrong and Smith were confronting him directly, the evidence was not circumstantial. It was empirical. To deny the charges would force MI5 into a formal adversarial investigation, drawing in witnesses, producing surveillance photographs, and expanding the circle of knowledge. It would guarantee a catastrophic leak. Sitting in the wood-paneled room, the man who had controlled the global reach of the British Empire folded. The decades of carefully constructed armor, the reputation of the infallible monastic public servant, evaporated in seconds. Sir Maurice Oldfield lowered his head and confessed. He admitted to the core truth that destroyed his career. He confirmed that he had engaged in homosexual activities for years. He confessed to soliciting rent boys and engaging in transactional sex with anonymous men. He admitted that he had consistently, deliberately lied to the positive vetting officers throughout his entire rise to the top of MI6. He acknowledged that he had operated in a state of extreme vulnerability, fully aware that his actions violated the fundamental security protocols he himself had enforced upon others. The silence that followed the confession was profound. It was the sound of a monumental national security vacuum being confirmed. Oldfield had not just admitted to a personal failing, he had admitted to institutional fraud on a staggering scale. The British government had entrusted its most vital secrets, its nuclear posture, and the lives of its agents to a man who had actively invited blackmail from the moment he took office. Armstrong and Smith did not offer absolution. They offered an ultimatum. Oldfield was stripped of his security clearance, effectively blinding him from the intelligence apparatus he had ruled. He was ordered to immediately tender his resignation as security coordinator for Northern Ireland. He was to return to his flat, remain silent, and await the judgment of the Prime Minister. The first phase of the crisis was complete. The vulnerability had been neutralized. The active threat was removed from the board, but the secondary, far more dangerous phase was just beginning. The file, now containing a signed catastrophic confession from the former head of MI6, was no longer just an intelligence problem. It was a political explosive. Armstrong gathered the dossier, locked it in his briefcase, and made the short walk to 10 Downing Street. It was time to hand the unredacted truth to the Iron Lady. Margaret Thatcher was about to discover the rot at the core of her empire. The walk from the Cabinet Office in Whitehall to 10 Downing Street is short, heavily policed, and historically insulated. When Sir Robert Armstrong made that walk in March 1980, the briefcase chained to his wrist contained the capacity to dismantle the British intelligence apparatus. He did not schedule a routine briefing with Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. He requested an immediate restricted audience. The circle of knowledge had to remain hermetically sealed. Every additional politician, aide, or secretary who learned the contents of the MI5 dossier exponentially increased the risk of a catastrophic leak. Margaret Thatcher operated her government with rigid moral absolutism. She built her political brand on the restoration of traditional British values, projecting an image of unyielding discipline and fierce national pride. She despised weakness, and she held a profound conservative disdain for the illicit subcultures operating in London's underground. When Armstrong placed the file on her desk and outlined the verified confession of Sir Maurice Oldfield, the collision of her personal morality and her executive responsibility was absolute. The documentation was clinically precise. The Prime Minister read the timeline of the former MI6 chief's nocturnal activities in Soho. She read the assessments from the RUC Special Branch and the surveillance reports from MI5 watchers. Finally, she read the transcript of Oldfield's total capitulation. The man she had personally recalled to service, the man she had entrusted with the stabilization of Northern Ireland, was a chronic, active liability who had spent decades soliciting male prostitutes in the streets of the capital. The initial reaction inside the Prime Minister's study was not a debate on ethics or the tragedy of a double life. It was a cold forensic assessment of institutional survival. Thatcher's immediate directive was to lock down the intelligence. She recognized instantly that the crisis was not about Oldfield the man. It was about Oldfield the repository of state secrets. If the facts within that dossier became public knowledge, the domestic political scandal would be the least of her problems. The true danger lay across the Atlantic and across the Iron Curtain. The global intelligence network functions on a bedrock of absolute operational security and mutual trust. The United Kingdom's position in the Cold War was entirely dependent on the UK-USA agreement, the foundation of the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance. British intelligence relied heavily on American satellite telemetry, signals intelligence, and nuclear positioning data. The CIA and the NSA shared this information under the strict assumption that the British security vetting process was impenetrable. The American intelligence community was still deeply traumatized by the Soviet infiltration of the British establishment in the 1950s and 1960s. Counterintelligence chiefs in Washington had long harbored suspicions that the rot inside MI6 had never been fully excised. If Margaret Thatcher allowed it to become public that the supreme commander of British foreign intelligence was highly susceptible to Soviet blackmail and had been routinely engaging in the exact behaviors targeted by KGB honey traps, the transatlantic umbilical cord would be severed. The Americans would instantly freeze the flow of classified data to London. The United Kingdom would be blinded on the global stage. Simultaneously, the KGB would weaponize the scandal with devastating efficiency. Moscow would not even need to launch an active disinformation campaign. The truth itself was a sufficient weapon. They would broadcast the sheer incompetence of the British vetting system to the world. Every British intelligence officer operating deep undercover in Eastern Europe would instantly become suspect, their covers blown by the sheer association with a compromised leadership. The Soviet bloc would use the scandal to fracture the Western alliance, proving that the British establishment was decadent, corrupt, and fundamentally insecure. Thatcher was faced with a stark binary choice. She could allow the legal and disciplinary protocols to proceed, publicly fire Oldfield, prosecute him for his security breaches, and watch the international standing of the United Kingdom burn. Or she could execute a state-sponsored cover-up, bury the evidence, lie to the public, and protect the institution. The Iron Lady did not hesitate. Pragmatism overrode principle. She ordered the immediate permanent suppression of the MI5 investigation. Sir Maurice Oldfield was to be excised from the government without a trace of the actual cause. The mechanics of a state cover-up require a plausible, unassailable alternative narrative. A sudden, unexplained resignation by the security coordinator in Northern Ireland during a period of intense IRA violence would trigger massive press speculation. Investigative journalists would start digging, sources would be pressured, and the truth would eventually surface. The government needed a shield? They found it in the biological reality of Oldfield's physical decay. Oldfield had recently begun experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress. He had complained of stomach pains and fatigue to his colleagues. It was a genuine medical issue, one that would later be diagnosed as terminal stomach cancer. The state seized upon this illness and weaponized it into a perfect, impenetrable defense. It is the golden rule of institutional deception. The most effective lies are constructed around a solid core of undeniable truth. Armstrong and Thatcher drafted the strategy. Oldfield would not be fired. He would graciously step down. His departure would be framed not as a disgrace, but as a tragic loss for the nation. The Prime Minister's office would issue a carefully worded press release citing ill health as the sole reason for his sudden departure from Stormont Castle. The media would be fed a narrative of an aging patriot, a man who had given his life to the defense of the realm, finally forced to yield his post because his body could no longer sustain the punishing workload. The execution of this lie required absolute compliance from the civil service and the intelligence chiefs. Sir Howard Smith locked the surveillance reports and the confession deep within the restricted vaults of MY5. The RUC Special Branch officers, who had initially reported Oldfield's behavior, were silenced through the strict hierarchy of the Official Secrets Act. The inner circle of MI6 was kept entirely in the dark. The state manufactured a vacuum and sealed it. Back in his flat in Marsham Court, Oldfield waited in a state of suspended animation. He had confessed. He anticipated the imminent destruction of his public life, the stripping of his knighthood, the media circus outside his door. He understood the mechanics of disgrace, but the executioners never arrived. Instead, he received his final orders from the Cabinet Office. He was instructed to submit a formal letter of resignation citing medical grounds. He was informed that his pension would remain intact, his honors would not be revoked, and his reputation would be publicly protected. In exchange, he was to disappear quietly into retirement and never speak of the interrogation. The psychological weight of this arrangement was profound. The state did not forgive Oldfield. It simply recognized that punishing him was too expensive. He was transformed from the architect of British intelligence into a heavily guarded liability. He was allowed to keep his liberty and his public honor, but only as a necessary component of the government's lie. The very apparatus that had hunted him down and exposed his darkest compulsions was now his most aggressive defender. He was trapped in a gilded cage built of classified documents and false press releases. When Downing Street finally issued the announcement, the British press swallowed the narrative whole. Fleet Street ran glowing editorials praising Oldfield's decades of shadow warfare against the Soviet Union. Newspapers published retrospective profiles detailing his ascetic dedication to his country, completely ignorant of the fact that the man they were eulogizing had spent his nights systematically breaching national security in the alleys of Soho. Members of Parliament stood in the House of Commons and delivered solemn tributes to his service. Thatcher stood at the dispatch box and projected total authority. She publicly accepted Oldfield's resignation with expressed regret, leaning heavily on the tragedy of his failing health. There was no tremor in the state's facade. The Prime Minister deliberately misled the Parliament, the press, and the British public to ensure the survival of the intelligence establishment. The cover-up was seamless, brutal, and entirely effective. The crisis was contained. But burying a secret of this magnitude inside a bureaucracy is not a permanent solution. It is a delay tactic. The documents existed, the witnesses existed. And in the claustrophobic world of London's political and intelligence elite, secrets possess a corrosive quality. They degrade the containers built to hold them. Oldfield was removed from the board, but the knowledge of what he was and what the government had done to protect him began to slowly seep into the foundation of Whitehall. The silence of forced retirement is a specific kind of psychological execution. For a man who had spent 3 decades dictating the operational tempo of global espionage, the sudden absence of classified briefings, encrypted cables, and executive authority was a violent shock. Sir Maurice Oldfield was confined to his flat in Marsham Court, surrounded by the quiet hum of Westminster. The government had granted him his pension, his knighthood, and his physical freedom, but it had entirely erased his relevance. He was a ghost permitted to haunt his own life, so long as he never spoke to the living. The psychological architecture of his existence collapsed inward. Oldfield had constructed his identity upon the absolute control of information. He was the man who knew everything about everyone, the ultimate arbiter of loyalty and deviance. Now, the state he had sworn to protect was holding his own deviance over his head like a guillotine. The paranoia he had once weaponized against Soviet defectors was now directed at him. He knew the capabilities of MI5. He knew that his flat was likely bugged. He knew that the protection detail assigned to him, ostensibly to guard him from IRA assassins, was actually there to ensure he did not attempt to contact the press, foreign intelligence services, or his former associates in the Soho underworld. He was under permanent, unacknowledged house arrest. There is a precise consequence, a mechanical settling of debts when a man is destroyed by the very system he helped build. Oldfield had spent his tenure at Century House enforcing the positive vetting process. He had systematically purged junior officers for minor infractions, hidden debts, and sexual nonconformity, operating under the ruthless logic that vulnerability was treason. He had condemned men to professional ruin for harboring a fraction of the risk he carried nightly. Now the machine he had calibrated to hunt the weak had turned its lenses upon him. He was trapped in the exact mechanism of his own design. The public narrative hailed him as a titan of the Cold War. The private reality was that he was a captive of his own hypocrisy, monitored by his former subordinates. The physical deterioration of his body accelerated in tandem with his professional exile. The cover story manufactured by Margaret Thatcher in the Cabinet Office was that Oldfield had stepped down due to failing health. This was the government's most effective shield because it was anchored in an undeniable biological truth. Oldfield was dying. The stomach pains that had plagued him during his final months in Northern Ireland were the early manifestations of aggressive terminal gastric cancer. The state weaponized his mortality. Every visible pound he lost, every public appearance where he looked frail and hollowed out, served to solidify the lie. The government did not have to forge medical records or invent symptoms. They simply allowed the natural progression of his disease to validate their fabricated press release. His physical decay became an asset to national security. The more he withered, the more plausible the narrative of the exhausted, ailing patriot became. The establishment watched him die with clinical relief, knowing that the grave is the only absolute guarantor of silence. But a secret of this magnitude generates a gravitational pull. It distorts the behavior of the people tasked with maintaining it. The circle of knowledge surrounding Oldfield's confession was minuscule, restricted to the Prime Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, the head of MI5, and a handful of senior operatives. However, Whitehall is an ecosystem built on the currency of hidden information. When a massive data point is removed from the board without a logical explanation, the intelligence community notices the vacuum. Senior officers within MI6 were deeply unsettled by the abruptness of Oldfield's departure from Belfast. They understood the nature of the man. Oldfield was a workaholic who viewed retirement as a kind of death. He would not have abandoned a high-stakes deployment like Northern Ireland simply because of stomach ulcers, not without ensuring a meticulous phased transition of power. The surgical speed of his extraction bore the hallmarks of an intelligence panic, not a medical emergency. Whispers began to circulate in the secure dining rooms of London's elite gentlemen's clubs, in the insulated corridors of the Foreign Office, and among retired spy masters who still maintained access to the internal rumor mill. These men did not know the details of the Soho rent boys or the MI5 interrogation room, but their instincts told them the official narrative was structurally unsound. The official silence from Downing Street was too rigid, too perfectly choreographed. The primary fear haunting the Cabinet Office during this period was not the British press, but the KGB residencies in London. The domestic cover-up was holding, but the government had no way of knowing if Soviet intelligence had already penetrated Oldfield's secret before MI5 intercepted him. The KGB operated extensive surveillance networks in the very areas of the West End where Oldfield had hunted for anonymous encounters. The intelligence analysts at MI5 ran terrifying theoretical war games. If the KGB had identified Oldfield during one of his nighttime excursions, they would have documented it. They might not have confronted him immediately. The Soviets were known for their strategic patience. They could have been waiting for the optimal moment to apply the leverage. If Moscow possessed photographs of the Director General of MI6 with a male prostitute, they possessed a weapon capable of shattering the Five Eyes alliance. The British government lived in a state of suspended terror, waiting for a diplomatic back-channel threat or a sudden devastating leak in a foreign newspaper. Every morning, counterintelligence officers scanned international intelligence summaries, bracing for the detonation that would signal Moscow had decided to pull the trigger. The detonation never came. Whether through sheer mathematical luck or a catastrophic failure of Soviet surveillance, the KGB had seemingly missed the greatest target of the Cold War, operating entirely unprotected in their own hunting grounds. Oldfield had navigated a minefield blindfolded and emerged intact, only to be dismantled by his own side. By the winter of 1980, Oldfield was largely confined to a hospital bed. The man who had once possessed the clearance to order assassinations and destabilize regimes was reduced to managing the schedule of his pain medication. His visitors were strictly monitored. He was not permitted to write memoirs, grant interviews, or leave behind any unvetted personal papers. The state ensured that his final days were sterile and tightly controlled. Sir Maurice Oldfield died on March 11th, 1981, at the age of 65. The British establishment reacted with an immediate, overwhelming display of state-sanctioned mourning. The obituaries published in the Times, the Telegraph, and the Guardian were masterpieces of institutional mythology. They eulogized him as the definitive public servant, a man of monastic dedication who had sacrificed his personal life for the defense of the realm. They praised his intellect, his austere lifestyle, and his unwavering moral compass. Journalists who had never met him wrote extensively about his flawless character. Memorial services were held in London. Members of the intelligence community, senior military figures, and politicians gathered to pay their respects to the empty vessel of his public persona. Margaret Thatcher, the woman who had stripped him of his clearance and ordered his bureaucratic execution, publicly lauded his unparalleled contribution to the security of the United Kingdom. The funeral marked the successful conclusion of the active phase of the cover-up. The physical evidence was buried, the primary liability was dead. The government closed the file. Sir Robert Armstrong and Sir Howard Smith had successfully navigated the crisis, protecting the alliance with the United States and denying the Soviet Union a historic propaganda victory. The system had functioned exactly as designed. It had protected itself. For a brief period, the history of British intelligence remained perfectly intact. Oldfield's legacy as the inspiration for M was cemented in the public consciousness. He was safely archived as a hero. But the establishment failed to account for the slow, corrosive nature of suppressed truth. A lie requires constant energy to maintain, and the people holding the secret were beginning to age, retire, and lose their grip on the narrative. The airtight seal placed over the events of 1980 was about to face the relentless pressure of time and the changing political landscape of the late 1980s. The ghost of Sir Maurice Oldfield was not finished with the British government. The grave provides absolute physical security, but it offers zero defense against the political machinery of the living. When the British establishment buried Sir Maurice Oldfield in the spring of 1981, they believed they had successfully entombed the catastrophic security failures of his tenure alongside his physical remains. Margaret Thatcher's government had executed a flawless containment protocol. They had removed a severely compromised Director General of MI6, shielded the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance from a fatal rupture, and maintained the impenetrable facade of the United Kingdom security apparatus. The file was sealed. The lie was recorded as history, but state secrets operate according to the laws of radioactive decay. They possess a specific measurable half-life. The containment vessel constructed by the Cabinet Office was built from fabricated press releases, enforced silence, and the Official Secrets Act. Over time, the internal pressure of the suppressed truth began to stress the structural integrity of that vessel. A cover-up of this magnitude requires absolute perpetual discipline from every individual who possesses the knowledge. Human nature, bureaucratic resentment, and shifting political alliances guarantee that such discipline cannot hold indefinitely. The mid-1980s delivered a series of seismic shocks to the British intelligence community that fundamentally altered the environment in which Oldfield's secret was hidden. The intelligence services, historically shielded by an unwritten covenant of press deference and parliamentary discretion, were suddenly plunged into a brutal, highly public civil war. The catalyst was a profound internal fracture within MI5 itself. A faction of disaffected retired intelligence officers became convinced that the agency had been deeply penetrated by Soviet assets at the highest levels, and that successive governments had actively covered up the extent of the infiltration. This paranoia crystallized in the form of Peter Wright, a former senior MI5 counterintelligence officer. Wright bypassed the British legal system entirely and decamped to Australia to publish his memoirs, Spycatcher. The manuscript was a direct, devastating assault on the mythology of British intelligence. It alleged treason, illegal surveillance operations, and a systematic culture of high-level cover-ups. The Thatcher government reacted with disproportionate, panicked aggression. They launched a massive international legal campaign to ban the publication of the book, deploying the full weight of the state to silence a single retired operative. The Spycatcher litigation was a strategic disaster for the British government. The heavy-handed legal tactics did not suppress the information. They amplified it globally. The spectacle of the British state desperately attempting to gag a former spy signaled to the international press that the intelligence establishment was harboring massive unexploded ordnance. The unwritten rules of deference evaporated. Investigative journalists, previously hesitant to probe the inner workings of MI5 and MI6, recognized that the establishment was bleeding. The hunting season opened. In this volatile, hyper-scrutinized atmosphere, the sealed file on Sir Maurice Oldfield began to leak. The leak did not originate from the KGB, nor did it come from the Soho underworld, where Oldfield had conducted his illicit transactions. It originated from within the rigid, deeply cynical corridors of Whitehall. The resentment harbored by senior intelligence officers regarding Oldfield's sudden, unexplained exit in 1980 had never fully dissipated. Many within the security apparatus felt profoundly betrayed. They had spent their careers enduring the draconian scrutiny of the positive vetting process, subjecting their personal lives to forensic examination, only to discover that the architect of that very system had operated with total impunity while engaging in the highest risk behavior imaginable. The Whisper network accelerated. Unnamed security sources protected by journalistic anonymity began dropping fragmented data points to trusted reporters in Fleet Street. They did not hand over the MI5 dossier, but they provided enough operational details to fracture the official narrative. They pointed to the speed of his resignation. They highlighted the involvement of the RUC Special Branch and the direct intervention of the Cabinet Secretary. They suggested that the narrative of stomach cancer, while medically true, was deployed as a convenient smokescreen for a much darker systemic failure. By early 1987, the whispers had coalesced into solid, actionable intelligence within the Westminster press lobby. The rumor was no longer confined to the gentlemen's clubs. It was circulating in the newsrooms. The specific nature of Oldfield's compulsion, his frequent solicitation of rent boys, and his subsequent confession to MI5 was known to a dangerous number of political editors. The government's fabricated history was facing imminent collapse. Margaret Thatcher found herself trapped in a rapidly shrinking tactical space. The political calculus that had justified the cover-up in 1980 was now threatening to destroy her government. She had built her entire political identity on the concepts of unyielding integrity, national security, and strict Victorian morality. If a newspaper published an investigative expose revealing that her government had actively shielded a deeply compromised homosexual spy master, the resulting scandal would shatter her authority. The press would accuse her of lying to the House of Commons. Her conservative base would view the incident as an unforgivable moral betrayal. The opposition party would demand resignations across the cabinet. Thatcher recognized that she could no longer control the perimeter. The story was going to break. The only remaining executive option was a controlled demolition. She had to detonate the scandal herself on her own terms within the highly structured theater of Parliament, before the press could dictate the narrative. The mechanism for a controlled political detonation in the United Kingdom is the planted parliamentary question. It is a choreographed maneuver. A loyal member of Parliament, acting on instructions from the government whips, submits a highly specific question to the Prime Minister. This provides the Prime Minister with a formalized pretext to place a statement onto the official public record. On April 23, 1987, the theater was activated. Conservative MP Ivan Lawrence stood in the House of Commons and asked the Prime Minister to comment on the escalating security rumors surrounding the late Sir Maurice Oldfield. Margaret Thatcher stepped to the dispatch box. The chamber, usually a chaotic arena of partisan shouting, fell into a tight, expectant silence. Thatcher delivered her statement with the cold, measured cadence of a clinician reading an autopsy report. She did not raise her voice. She did not offer apologies for the 7-year deception. She stated for the official record that in March 1980, information had been brought to her attention regarding the conduct of Sir Maurice Oldfield. She confirmed that Oldfield had been interviewed and that he had admitted to engaging in homosexual conduct. She stated that, as a direct result of this admission, his security clearance had been immediately canceled. She confirmed that his subsequent resignation as security coordinator in Northern Ireland was forced by this revocation of clearance, definitively destroying the lie that he had retired solely due to failing health. The admission was a masterclass in political damage control. Thatcher gave the press exactly what they wanted: the sensational confirmation of the MI6 chief's secret life. But she surgically amputated the most damaging aspects of the reality. She did not mention the rent boys. She did not mention Soho. She deliberately minimized the catastrophic nature of the security breach, framing it merely as homosexual conduct rather than acknowledging the high-risk, transactional exploitation of the urban underworld that had left the nation entirely exposed to Soviet blackmail. Crucially, Thatcher explicitly asserted that there was no evidence Oldfield had ever compromised national security or passed secrets to an enemy. This final assertion was the ultimate necessary fiction. It was technically true that MI5 had found no concrete proof of espionage resulting from Oldfield's encounters, but the absence of evidence was not evidence of security. The intelligence community knew with absolute certainty that Oldfield had placed himself in a position of terminal vulnerability for years. Whether the KGB had successfully exploited that vulnerability or simply missed the opportunity was irrelevant to the fact that the Director General of MI6 had fundamentally compromised the entire apparatus. Thatcher's statement was designed to protect the Five Eyes alliance. She was telling Washington, "We found a flaw, we neutralized it, and no data was lost." The reaction in the British press was explosive. The newspapers that had printed glowing hagiographic obituaries just 6 years prior violently reversed their editorial lines. The headlines stripped away Oldfield's legacy in a matter of hours. The ultimate spy master was reduced to a tabloid caricature. The broadsheets analyzed the devastating implications for national security, questioning how the positive vetting system could have failed so completely. The public whiplash was severe. The citizenry had been trained to view the intelligence establishment through the glamorous, highly competent lens of Ian Fleming's fiction. Oldfield had been presented as the physical anchor of that mythology. The revelation of his sordid, desperate reality shattered the illusion. It laid bare the hypocrisy of an elite class that demanded total sacrifice and moral purity from its subordinates, while operating with reckless, dangerous indulgence in the shadows. Yet amid the outrage, the state achieved its primary objective. The anger was directed entirely at the dead man. Sir Maurice Oldfield absorbed the full kinetic impact of the scandal. He became the universal scapegoat for systemic institutional failure. The press attacked his morality, his judgment, and his hypocrisy. They dissected his double life and painted him as a tragic, flawed anomaly within an otherwise functional system. The machine that had enabled him, protected him, and lied for him emerged largely unscathed. No senior civil servant was fired for orchestrating the cover-up. No MI5 or MI6 officer was disciplined for the catastrophic failure of the vetting process. Margaret Thatcher weathered the immediate political storm by projecting the image of a leader who had acted decisively upon discovering the truth, conveniently omitting the fact that she had actively buried that truth for 7 years. The establishment used Oldfield in death exactly as they had used him in life, as a shield. They leveraged his ruin to protect their own continuity. This is the central, brutal truth of state espionage. Intelligence agencies do not exist to serve an absolute moral standard. They exist to secure advantage, project power, and ensure the survival of the state. When an individual within that system becomes a liability, the system will execute them. When the system itself is threatened, it will manufacture whatever reality is required to sustain its authority. Sir Maurice Oldfield was the architect of that system, a man who understood its mechanics better than anyone alive. His ultimate fate was not a miscarriage of justice. It was the exact calculated application of the rules he had enforced. He was consumed by the machine he built. The Oldfield scandal forced a quiet, ruthless recalibration within the walls of MI5 and MI6. The old guard, the eccentric academics and brilliant misfits who had run the Cold War, recognized that their era of insulated impunity was over. The positive vetting process was hardened. The internal surveillance mechanisms were turned inward with paranoid intensity. The agencies realized that their greatest existential threat was no longer the Soviet watcher standing across the street, but the unprotected vulnerabilities of the officers sitting inside the building. The era of the untouchable spy master was dead, killed by the exposure of its most prominent figure. The intelligence community entered the final years of the Cold War fundamentally altered, deeply suspicious of its own shadow, and hyper-aware that the most dangerous secrets are not the ones stolen by the enemy, but the ones buried by the state. The cover-up of Sir Maurice Oldfield was over, but the psychology of institutional deception was permanently embedded in the concrete of Century House. The state weaponized his physical decay to hide its institutional rot, ultimately throwing his legacy to the press when the lie could no longer hold. He spent his life enforcing a ruthless machine designed to crush vulnerability, completely blind to the fact that he would be ground in its gears. But the British establishment was not finished dealing with the fallout of its own arrogance. Oldfield was the head of foreign intelligence, a man operating in the gritty reality of the Cold War. The betrayal was shocking, but it was contained within the bureaucracy of Whitehall. There was, however, another secret. A secret that bypassed the concrete walls of MI5 and reached directly into the gilded halls of Buckingham Palace. A man whose hunting ground was not the dark alleys of Soho, but the private, heavily guarded corridors of the royal family. A man who assessed the Queen's art collection by day and handed the absolute deepest secrets of the British state to the Soviet Union by night. And when the government finally caught him, they didn't just cover it up. They granted him immunity and let him keep his royal title